Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The air smelled like old wood and wilting lilies, the kind that clung to your clothes and crawled into your nostrils until it became part of your breath. Grandma Ellie's funeral was exactly what I expected it to be: quiet, uncomfortable, and full of people pretending they missed her more than they actually did. The church was packed with black suits and stiff necks, people dabbing fake tears with tissues they'd probably pulled from glove compartments on the way over. I stood near the front, hands clenched together in my lap, staring at the closed casket and wondering how a woman with so much life in her had ended up in something so final, so small. Ray, of course, made his entrance like he was walking into a boardroom instead of a funeral. He strutted in, sunglasses still on despite the cloudy sky, shaking hands like he was running for office. My mother gave him a weak smile, the kind of smile she always reserved for him, equal parts admiration and fear, like a dog trained too long to flinch at a raised voice. I kept my mouth shut, my eyes forward, but my stomach twisted the way it always did when Ray was around. It wasn't just that he was arrogant, it was that he never had to pay for it. Not once. Not when he got caught cheating on Aunt Susan. Not when he bankrupted one of Grandma's rental properties with his half-assed investment schemes. Not even when he skipped out on hospice visits and showed up only for the Christmas photo ops. And yet, there he was, standing at the pulpit after the priest finished his final prayer, tapping on the microphone like he owned the damn place. "I just want to say a few words," he said, voice using that faux grief he'd perfected over the years. Ellie was more than my mother. She was my rock, my mentor, and I'm honored, so honored, to carry on her legacy. He paused for effect, letting the silence hang just long enough to make people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Then he smiled, wide, smug, teeth too white for a funeral, and said, as most of you probably guessed, she left everything to me. Because, well, I was her favorite. The words hit the room like a dropped glass, quick, shattering, leaving sharp edges behind. I could feel eyes darting in my direction, some pitying, some curious, a few already mentally calculating the value of Grandma's estate. My mother stared at her lap. Maggie, who hadn't even come, would have laughed herself sick if she heard this. And me? I didn't move. I just sat there and watched him bask in the moment, watched him soak in the attention like a sponge dipped in gasoline, waiting for the fire. That's when attorney Alice Kemp walked into the room. She was short, efficient-looking, with hair pulled so tight it looked like it hurt. She carried a leather folder and wore a face that didn't bend for anyone, not even Ray. "I've been asked to read Eleanor Monroe's last will and testament," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Ray chuckled. "Well, go ahead," he said, waving her forward like he was already king of the castle. "Let's make it official." Alice pulled a sealed envelope from her folder, crisp and ivory-colored, with a handwritten note across the front, to be read aloud. No exceptions. The weight in the room shifted. The air felt thicker. My pulse started drumming in my ears, not panic, not hope, just the unsettling sense that something was about to tip. Alice opened the envelope slowly, unfolded the paper inside, and cleared her throat. "I, Eleanor Monroe, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare the following to be my final will and testament." Ray leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, smug grin still plastered across his face like it had been carved in stone. "I leave the following to my son, Raymond Monroe," Alice continued, her voice steady and flat. "One box of my personal effects. Inside, he will find a mirror, so he can finally see what greed looks like." There was a beat of stunned silence, just a heartbeat, a breath, a pause in time, and then a few gasps from the back of the room. Ray sat frozen, mouth slightly open, eyes flicking toward Alice like he hadn't heard her correctly. "Excuse me," he stammered. Alice didn't flinch. "You heard correctly. Everything else, my properties, investments, heirlooms, accounts, and assets, are to be passed in full to my granddaughter, Claire Monroe." My ears rang. For a moment, I thought maybe I had misheard too. But then Alice continued reading the details, every clause, every asset, every dollar, and every piece of land I didn't even know existed. All of it, every single part, was mine. And just like that, Ray's smirk cracked. I didn't speak. I didn't move. But inside, I felt something shift, a storm, long quiet, finally beginning to rise. You could have heard a pin drop when the last line of the will left Alice Kemp's lips, her voice cool and indifferent, as though she hadn't just gutted the family's golden boy in front of a crowd of mourners dressed in black and facades. Ray still sat there, stunned into silence, the color slowly draining from his face as the reality of it sank deeper into the hollows of his ego. He looked like someone who'd shown up to a party expecting to be handed the crown, only to realize too late that he'd been the punchline all along. And I'll admit it, there was a twisted sort of satisfaction watching that smug expression evaporate off his face like steam from a boiling pot finally pulled off the heat. Somewhere behind me, I heard the rustling of guests shifting in their pews, whispers beginning to curl through the crowd like cigarette smoke at a family reunion, too many questions, not enough answers, and plenty of eager mouths ready to chew on the gossip. Ray didn't say a word, not at first. He just kept looking around the room like he expected someone to jump up and say it was all a mistake, that this was a prank or a misprint or a cruel joke gone too far. But no one did. No one could. Because Grandma Ellie had spoken, and the voice of the dead carries a weight no living man can shake. And then, like clockwork, he cracked. "This is ridiculous," he barked, standing so fast his chair screeched across the tile. She must have been confused. Manipulated. Senile, even. There's no way she meant this. No way she'd leave it all to her granddaughter, and nothing to her only son. But Alice, still calm as stone, raised an eyebrow and replied, "Your mother had a full psychological evaluation less than 6 months ago. Her mental faculties were sound, Mr. Monroe. And her wishes were documented thoroughly." She slid the documents back into her folder without a single flicker of emotion. "You're welcome to contest the will in court, of course. But I'd advise you to consider what that would expose. Publicly." And that was the moment I realized, this wasn't just a will. This was a warning. A declaration. A long overdue reckoning, carefully crafted and executed from beyond the grave. It wasn't just about inheritance. It was about judgment. A final verdict from a woman who had watched her son take and take and take for decades and finally decided to write her truth in ink instead of silence. After the service, people trickled out quickly, pretending to be polite, but clearly desperate to get home and share the drama with whoever would listen. My mother was pale, dazed, clutching her purse like it might run away from her. I tried to catch her eye, tried to read her face, but she didn't look at me, just kept walking, head down, like if she moved fast enough she could escape whatever mess her mother had just dropped into our laps. And Ray? He stormed off, muttering about lawyers and lawsuits, his voice growing louder the further he walked from the casket. Funny how fast grief turns to rage when entitlement gets interrupted. I stayed behind, unsure what I was supposed to feel. Gratitude? Vindication? Confusion? Maybe all of it. Maybe none of it. The truth was, I didn't want her money. I hadn't flown in from Chicago thinking I'd inherit anything more than a few awkward hugs and half-hearted condolences. But now I was holding the keys to an entire legacy, and somewhere in the swirl of disbelief, I could feel something deeper pulling at me, something heavier than just property deeds and trust funds. Something unfinished. Alice approached me as the last guest filed out, her face unreadable but her tone softer than before. "She left something else for you," she said, reaching into her leather case and pulling out a thick cream-colored envelope sealed with a wax stamp I hadn't seen since I was a kid. "She told me to give it to you directly, but only after the will was read." She was very specific about that. The envelope was marked in my grandmother's elegant cursive, "Claire, do not open until you're alone." And that's when it hit me, this wasn't over. Not even close. Because Grandma Ellie didn't just leave behind a mess. She left behind a map. And I had a feeling it was going to lead me somewhere far beyond a bank account. Have you ever had someone try to rob you of what's rightfully yours, then pretend it was love all along? Ever been told you should be grateful for crumbs while someone else dines on your damn feast? Because let me tell you, there's a particular kind of rage that builds in silence, slow and searing, until one day it's not just about money or fairness, it's about showing everyone what you're really made of when they thought you were just decoration in the background. That night, I sat in the guest bedroom of Grandma's old house, the smell of lavender still lingering faintly in the air, and I stared at that envelope for a long time before I opened it. My hands trembled just slightly, not from fear, not even from grief, but from the knowing that something was about to change again. And when I finally broke the seal, unfolded the first sheet of paper, and read her words, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was only the beginning. There's something strange about reading a letter from someone who isn't breathing anymore, especially when the words sound so alive you can almost hear their voice echoing inside your head. Grandma's handwriting was as crisp and sharp as I remembered, slanted just slightly to the right, loops precise and deliberate, not a single word wasted or smudged. She had always believed that words carried weight, that the way you wrote something said just as much as what you wrote. And this letter, from the very first sentence, didn't feel like a farewell. It felt like a command. Claire, if you're reading this, then you already know what I left you, and more importantly, what I didn't leave to him. But there are still things you don't know. Things I couldn't say while I was alive. Things I never trusted anyone else to handle but you. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for courage. Look in the place where truth was once hidden behind wallpaper. That last line snagged at something in my memory, something old, dusty, half-buried beneath childhood games and forgotten corners of the house. I folded the letter carefully, set it aside, and sat back in the creaky armchair near the window. The afternoon light was shifting across the floor in long shadows, that late-day gold that always reminded me of being small again, those endless summers when Maggie and I would run barefoot through the backyard, coming in sticky with popsicle juice and mosquito bites. Grandma's house hadn't changed much since then. The furniture still smelled like cedar and mothballs, and the wallpaper, floral, faded, stubborn as hell, still clung to the walls in places where time had tried to peel it away. That's when I remembered it, the sitting room off the main hall, the one we weren't allowed to play in because it had delicate things. I remembered one summer, maybe I was 9 or 10, watching Grandma press her palm against a section of wallpaper near the corner bookshelf, like she was checking for a heartbeat behind it. I hadn't thought about that moment in years. I'd written it off as one of those odd little adult habits kids never understand. But now it echoed in my brain like a bell ringing behind my ribs. I moved quietly down the hall, the floorboards groaning under my feet like they were reluctant to let old secrets rise. The room still looked untouched, the same faded rug, the same porcelain figurines on the shelves, the same musty curtains drawn halfway across the windows. I walked to that corner near the bookshelf, pressed my fingers against the wall, and felt something beneath the wallpaper, a faint outline, square, about the size of a shoebox lid. My pulse jumped. I peeled back the wallpaper gently, heart racing now, and there it was, an old wooden panel, barely noticeable unless you knew exactly where to look. Behind it was a shallow recess in the wall, and inside that, wrapped in faded oilcloth, was a small locked box. I carried it back to the kitchen, hands trembling slightly, the way they always do when you realize you've just touched a piece of someone else's unfinished life. The box had no label, no key in sight. But the moment I saw it, another memory kicked up like dust, Grandma's roll-top desk in the upstairs study, the one she always kept locked with a small brass key she wore around her neck for years, until one day she stopped wearing jewelry altogether. I found the key exactly where I hoped it would be, in the desk drawer, taped to the underside of a false bottom. My hands fumbled a little as I unlocked the box, not because I was nervous, but because some part of me already knew that what was inside would change everything I thought I knew about this family. Inside was a leather-bound journal, old but intact, the pages yellowed at the edges and filled with my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. Tucked beneath it, almost as an afterthought, was a small manila envelope. Inside was a key to a safety deposit box at a local bank and a note. Use this last. Trust your instincts first. I had barely flipped through the first 10 pages of the journal when I heard the front door open, heavy footsteps crossing the foyer, and a familiar voice calling my name. Maggie. My sister, unexpected and perfectly timed in the most chaotic way, like she always had been. She stepped into the kitchen, eyes sharp, lips curled in that half-smirk that always made me feel like she knew more than she let on. "Nice to see you didn't waste time tearing the place apart," she said, glancing at the open box on the table. "Did you know about this?" I asked, holding up the journal. She raised an eyebrow. "Depends. What's in it?" Tension snapped between us like a taut rubber band stretched too far. We hadn't spoken much over the years, not out of hatred, but because time has a way of making strangers out of siblings when no one bothers to reach across the space. But there was something in her face now, something unreadable and too calm for coincidence. I didn't answer her. I went back to the journal, flipping through the entries until something caught my eye tucked near the back. Pressed between 2 pages like a secret was an old newspaper clipping. The edges were brittle, the ink slightly faded, but the headline stopped me cold. "Prominent local businessman involved in real estate fraud scandal. Sources point to Raymond Monroe." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The house felt heavier now, like the walls had been holding their breath all these years, waiting for someone to uncover the rot beneath the wallpaper. And something told me this was only the first layer. Because if Grandma had gone to this much trouble to hide the truth, then whatever came next was going to be worse. Much worse. The next morning, the sun came through the lace curtains in long streaks of pale light, but it didn't feel warm. It felt intrusive, like the day itself had shown up too early and too eager, already clawing at the walls, already demanding that I keep digging through whatever mess my grandmother had left behind. I sat at the kitchen table, the journal still open in front of me, that newspaper clipping resting like a loaded gun between the pages. It was surreal to see Ray's name printed beneath a headline like that, not just because of what it meant, but because of what it confirmed. Something had been festering in this family long before Grandma's will ever became an issue. And now, finally, the rot was coming to the surface. I knew I couldn't make sense of any of it without answers, and there was only one person left in this family who might have them, even if she didn't want to admit it. I found my mother in the garden, where she always seemed to retreat whenever real conversations threatened to surface. She was trimming rose bushes that hadn't bloomed in years, her movements robotic and oddly graceful, like she was trying to distract herself from whatever I was about to say. I stood there watching her for a moment, the journal clutched tight in my hand, until she finally glanced up. "Is this really the best time to dig up the past?" she asked, as if she'd already prepared her defense without hearing the charges. I didn't answer that. I just held the newspaper clipping out toward her, the edges flapping gently in the breeze, like even the wind wanted her to look. "You want to explain this?" I asked, my voice flat, my patience already thinning like the skin on her weathered hands. Her face changed just slightly, just enough for me to know that she'd seen it before. Not recently, maybe not even in decades, but she recognized it. Her lips tightened, her eyes flickered toward the roses, and for a second, I thought she might actually speak. But instead, she turned away, clipped another thorny stem, and said, "That was a long time ago. It doesn't matter anymore." "That's not your call to make," I said, sharper than I intended, but too far past polite to pull back now. "You don't get to bury the past and expect everyone else to pretend it never existed." She didn't respond. She just kept cutting roses that weren't there. I walked away before I said something I'd regret, the kind of words that couldn't be unsaid even if they were true. Back inside, I retrieved the key Grandma had left in the locked box, the one marked for the safety deposit box downtown. I had no idea what I expected to find. Maybe more paperwork, maybe old jewelry, maybe nothing at all. But what I found hit harder than anything I could have prepared for. Inside the box were several neatly organized files, property deeds for parcels of land I didn't even know Grandma owned, handwritten notes detailing transactions with names I didn't recognize, and then, at the very bottom, a small envelope containing a photograph. It was black and white, curled slightly at the corners, and in it stood a woman I'd never seen before, holding a baby wrapped in a hand-knit blanket. On the back, in Grandma's handwriting, was a date, 42 years ago, and a single name, Ruth. I stared at it for a long time, turning it over again and again, hoping it would somehow explain itself. But it didn't. It just sat there, silent and heavy, a question with no immediate answer. When I showed it to Maggie later that evening, her reaction startled me. She didn't look confused. She didn't ask who Ruth was. She just tilted her head, squinting at the photo like she was piecing something together in her own mind. "You ever wonder if Ray's not actually who we think he is?" she said, and it didn't sound like a question. It sounded like a theory she'd been carrying around for a while but hadn't dared speak out loud. I stared at her, unsure what she meant. What if Grandma wasn't just protecting her assets? Maggie continued. What if she was protecting something else? Someone else? What if this baby, this Ruth, what if she's more than just some stranger? It was the kind of idea you want to dismiss instantly, the kind that makes your brain itch and your stomach twist, because it opens a door that should have stayed bolted shut. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces started shifting in my head, clicking into place in ways that made the past feel even darker than it already was. That night, the news started trickling in. Ray's name was showing up again, but this time it wasn't buried in old archives. A local journalist had somehow caught wind of the scandal, and suddenly there were online articles, tweets, whispers in business forums. His image, once polished and carefully managed, was beginning to tarnish in real time. I couldn't help but wonder if Grandma had made sure those dominoes were already lined up before she ever took her last breath. I was still sorting through the safety deposit files when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, the kind of hesitation you only feel when your gut knows something's coming and your brain just hasn't caught up yet. I let it go to voicemail, telling myself I'd listen later. But as soon as the message appeared, I tapped play. A woman's voice, low, measured, almost familiar, crackled through the speaker. "You don't know the full story yet, Claire," she said. "But you will. Soon." I didn't sleep that night, not even a little, and not because I was afraid, because fear had nothing on the strange electricity crawling under my skin now, but because my mind wouldn't stop running through the jagged pieces of everything I'd uncovered so far, trying to make the puzzle fit. Every corner of my grandmother's life had begun unraveling in my hands, and yet, somehow, the image wasn't getting clearer. It was getting darker. It was getting deeper. That voicemail echoed in my head like a warning bell I couldn't unhear, like a voice from the grave shaking loose everything I thought I knew. And by morning, something in me had shifted, because now I wasn't just curious. Now I was angry. Angry in that bone-deep, blood-hot kind of way that doesn't fade until truth is peeled back layer by layer. I started reading the journal again, this time with intention, not just flipping through pages, but absorbing every line, every scribbled note, every underlined word my grandmother had written like breadcrumbs for me to follow. And somewhere between the careful recollections and vague reflections, I found the entry that changed everything. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple, almost buried in the middle of a longer paragraph, like she couldn't bear to put it front and center, but couldn't leave it unsaid either. "He took from me long before he tried to take the money. He took her, too. Took her and buried the truth with silence and shame. I'll never forgive him for that. But maybe I can still make it right." At first, I didn't understand what she meant. But then I found another page, tucked behind the others, a folded sheet that looked newer than the rest, dated just 3 years ago. On it, in my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting, was a single sentence that hit me like a punch to the chest. "The girl in the photo is his." The words were plain, but their weight was enormous. I sat back in my chair, hands trembling, heart thudding like a war drum in my chest. It made sense now, why Grandma had kept that photo, why she hid it, why she left everything to me instead of her only son. That baby, that child held by a woman I now knew was named Ruth, wasn't just some distant relative or forgotten friend. She was Ray's daughter. A daughter he'd hidden. A daughter he'd erased. A daughter he'd abandoned before anyone in the family ever knew she existed. And Grandma had never forgiven him for it. It wasn't just about money. It never had been. This was justice. This was revenge wrapped in inheritance papers and delivered through legal channels because Grandma knew she wouldn't live long enough to see him fall on her own. So she built a trap, a cold, precise, airtight trap, and waited for death to pull the trigger. She left it all to me not because I was the favorite, not because I deserved it more, but because I was the only one who could be trusted to carry out what she couldn't finish in life. I was still sitting in that realization when Maggie walked in again, holding a coffee cup and wearing a look I recognized instantly. She knew something more. I didn't even ask. I just stared at her and said, "You knew about this, didn't you?" She hesitated for a moment, then sat across from me, her eyes steady and unapologetic. "Not everything," she said slowly, "but enough. Grandma told me about Ruth once, years ago, in one of her more lucid moments. She didn't name names, but she said there was a child, a girl who never got a chance." I thought it was just one of her stories. I didn't realize she meant Ray. I wanted to be furious. I wanted to shout at her for keeping it from me, for letting me stumble through this minefield blind. But the truth was, I understood why she hadn't said anything. Our family didn't talk about real things. We buried them. We wallpapered over them. We smiled through teeth grinding in silence. This was how we were raised, to survive, not to speak. But now I had a choice in front of me. I could keep it all. I could take the estate, the assets, the legacy Grandma left me, and no one would question it. The legal trail was clean. The paperwork was airtight. No one even knew Ruth's daughter existed, not officially, not on record, not in any public way. I could take the win, close the chapter, walk away with everything tied up neatly in my name. Or I could find her. The girl Ray tried to erase. The child Grandma mourned in silence. The woman who probably had no idea she'd ever belong to this twisted, broken tree of a family. I could share what was rightfully hers, even though the law didn't say I had to. Even though the world wouldn't demand it. But I would know. And maybe that was enough. I stared at the photo again, at the baby's small face and the tired eyes of the woman holding her, and I knew the answer wasn't going to come easy. Because this wasn't just about right and wrong. This was about what kind of person I was willing to become now that the power was in my hands. And somewhere deep in my chest, I felt the question start to burn. Would I finish Grandma's revenge the way she planned it? Or would I rewrite the ending altogether? Either way, someone was going to pay. The only question was, how much? Some decisions don't come with fireworks or clarity or the sweet rush of righteousness you hope will come when you finally step out of the shadows and into the light. Some decisions settle in you slowly, like rain soaking into the earth, quiet and steady and cold. That's how it felt in the days that followed, the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place, the weight of truth pressing into my chest, and the knowledge that I held the power to either bury the story for good or bring it full circle in the only way that mattered. Not to Grandma. Not to Ray. But to myself. I spent nearly a week trying to find the woman from the photo, the girl who would have grown up in a different house, with a different name, in a different world altogether. She wasn't hard to find, not after I dug through the rest of the files in the safety deposit box. Grandma had kept a paper trail more detailed than any private investigator could have managed. Birth certificate copies, a social worker's report, even a hospital discharge record from the day Ruth had walked out of town with a newborn and no one to catch her if she fell. Her name was Rachel now. Rachel Gardner. Mid-40s, worked at a small community clinic in a rural county 2 hours north, had 2 kids of her own and a husband who ran a local hardware store. She had no idea what she'd come from. And maybe that was the cruelest part. She hadn't just been erased from the family. She'd been erased from herself. When I called her, I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to start a conversation like that. "Hi, you don't know me, but I'm your cousin, or maybe your sister, or maybe just the messenger of a truth someone else should have told you a long time ago." But she didn't hang up. She didn't yell or shut down. She listened. Quietly, carefully, and then asked if we could meet. I drove up the next morning, the estate documents in a folder on the passenger seat, and a knot in my stomach that hadn't loosened since the will was read. Rachel was waiting outside the clinic when I arrived, wearing jeans and a windbreaker, her hair pulled back in a braid like she'd just come off a shift. She looked nothing like Ray, and maybe everything like him, depending on how closely you wanted to look. She shook my hand without hesitation, and we sat on a bench out back, under a creaky old oak tree while the wind picked up dust from the gravel lot behind us. I told her the whole story, not all at once, not like a fairy tale or a confession, but in pieces, in the only way I knew how to tell something that was too ugly to fit neatly into a single sentence. She didn't cry. She didn't accuse me. She just stared out at the trees, jaw tight, like she was trying to decide whether to feel grief or fury first. When I handed her the documents, the ones that transferred a portion of the estate to her name, land, money, and rights to the family house if she wanted them, she didn't say thank you. She just nodded once, slow and steady, like someone carrying a burden they didn't ask for but could no longer ignore. And maybe that was all I needed from her. Not gratitude. Just recognition. Just one person to confirm that what I'd done mattered. After that, I didn't stay long. I didn't want to linger in the middle ground between blood and responsibility, didn't want to become part of her world just because mine had shattered. I left quietly, drove back to the city, and within 2 weeks, the estate was sold. The house, the land, everything. I didn't auction it, didn't hold on to it for sentimental value, didn't try to preserve a legacy that had never truly belonged to any of us in the first place. Ray, meanwhile, was drowning. The leaked stories had turned into formal investigations. Former business partners were cutting ties, family friends were pulling back, and creditors were circling like sharks. Whatever reputation he had left was in ruins, and though I didn't celebrate it openly, I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a quiet satisfaction watching him lose the mask he'd worn so comfortably for so long. Linda, as expected, said nothing. She floated through the aftermath like it was a phase, like it was someone else's life unraveling instead of her own. When I told her I was leaving town for good, she gave me the same weak smile she'd given Ray at the funeral, as if her silence could smooth out the sharp corners of everything we'd just lived through. But I didn't need her understanding anymore. I'd stopped needing it years ago. Before I left, I visited Grandma's grave one last time. The cemetery was empty, the wind brushing through the tall grass, the sky low and gray like it knew how heavy the moment felt. I knelt down, pulled the empty letter envelope from my coat pocket, and placed it gently on the headstone, letting it rest there like a final offering, a final answer to the question I hadn't known I was asking all along. "You didn't just leave me money," I whispered, voice rough with something I couldn't name. "You left me clarity." And as I stood to leave, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel avenged. I just felt done. They thought it was about wealth. It was never about wealth. It was about truth and making sure the right people finally paid the price. Whether I did the right thing, whether I gave too much or too little, whether revenge healed anything or just shifted the scars, I'll never fully know. But I walked away and I didn't look back. And sometimes, that's all you can do. Walk away and make peace with what you leave behind.